Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Clarke. I was asked to give this introduction to the second Ahmet Yücel Odabaşi Memorial Colloquium since I had worked directly with Yücel at British Ship Research Association here in the UK for some 15 years. During that time, we worked on many projects, and I'm happy to say that we never really disagreed or had any strong words between us. We understood each other perfectly. He trusted me and I trusted him. It was a symbiotic relationship. I first met Yücel Odabaşi over 40 years ago. In 1975, he came to BSRA Wallsend near Newcastle, just having spent some time in Strathclyde University in Glasgow. He was working on ship motions and transverse stability using the energy methods developed by Lyapunov, and initially he continued this work in Wallsend. At that time, I was manager of the Hydrodynamics department, and Yücel was extremely interested to find out what kind of work we were doing. At BSRA, we had realized that any real progress from first principles in maneuvering and control of ships was dependent upon being able to calculate the zero-frequency horizontal added mass coefficients for the complete hull. This could lead directly to a better knowledge of the velocity and acceleration derivatives of the ship's hull. This is vital, as they are nothing other than the coefficients in the equations of motion. I was using conformal mapping of the body sections of the hull. Yücel was in favour of surface singularity methods over the complete hull, something that he would develop in other important ways later on. Yücel's time at Wallsend was temporarily interrupted, since in 1976 he had to return to Turkey to complete his military service. On his return to BSRA, he began to work on propeller-excited vibration and hull resistance databases. He assembled an excellent team for this work. Allan will remember this well if he is in the audience today. Yücel was quickly promoted to be chief scientist at BSRA. He had a brief to overlook most of the work that was being carried out and to help where required. In the mid-1970s, Yücel and I were heavily involved in the hydrodynamic modelling of wave energy devices. That is, the various devices that were under consideration in the UK at that time. 40 years have gone by, and everyone has either forgotten or decided to ignore the findings of this earlier work, which showed the impracticality of these devices. Yücel loved to use and quote from obscure mathematical books, such as Abramovich and Stegman's Mathematical Tables, Gratstein and Ressig's book on integrals, or maybe Gantmacher's classical book on matrices. Moving on, Yücel developed his ideas of surface singularities into a concept which he called spline hydrodynamics. This entailed going straight to a spline representation of the singularity distribution around the body, and this was done without carrying out a spline fitting of the body surface first of all. Barbaros Okan will remember this if he is there today. Yücel gave his valuable support to the work I was doing in the early 1980s on building an analog computer-based ship simulator. We were able to obtain a second-hand Redifon Astrodata Ci5000 analog computer from an offshore company. This gave us the opportunity to carry out real-time interactive simulations using the full nonlinear equations of motion. We were able to increase the capacity of the Ci5000 analog by acquiring the largest one ever made. This was French government surplus material, which was bought from the French Navy at a public auction near Angoulême in France. The price was £450 plus transportation. I could talk for another hour about that episode, but that's not our purpose here today. The increased capacity of the computer then allowed us to carry out more realistic harbour manoeuvring simulations. Ship operators such as P+O Ferries, Sally Line and Cilia Line, and several others, sent their ship's officers for training. Now, Yücel ensured that I had a virtual free hand to develop this analog simulation work. He had to convince the BMT directors of the value of this work and that it would be necessary in the future. They were extremely dismissive and opposed to this work. I believe they thought that since the computing equipment had been put together on a very small, tight budget, that the results it produced would be of very little worth. Their industrial advisors thought it irrelevant and could not see the point of it. They were what our dear friend, the late Professor George Snaith, a one-time director of BSRA, used to call the mafia of ignorance. Later, when Yücel had opened up his USA office, BMT International, he gave further help with the ship manoeuvring simulation work by linking up with Hydrodynamics in Laurel, Maryland, a major US player in the field. They were using the wonderful silicon graphics image generating system as part of their ship manoeuvring simulation work for the US Coast Guard. This was absolute state-of-the-art equipment that we could only dream about. Nevertheless, this cooperation gave us the idea of going totally digital. In the late 1980s, we decided to move away from the Ci5000 analog system and adopt a completely new transputer-based digital parallel processor system. This was revolutionary hardware at that time, which needed a completely different and very challenging programming language called Occam. Remember, all you had then were IBM PCs, and this was before 486s, Pentium processors, quad cores, or Xbox graphics. How much easier is it today? At that time, however, the analog system encouraged the use of polynomial representation of the hydrodynamic forces and moments. The function generation was simpler. The move to an entirely digital simulation system gave rise to a new method of storing all the force and moment coefficients digitally in lookup tables. These could be interrogated online, and the necessary values found by simple linear interpolation. This simulation system was given the name REMBRANDT. It was part of our plans to sell this system in miniaturized form, provided it could be made robust enough. It could be used on ships to train junior officers, and we demonstrated this possibility to interested parties, such as the Taiwanese container ship company Evergreen, and also to the Royal Navy. Once again, the BMT directors were extremely dismissive and thought this work was impractical and they could not really see the point of it. Probably the industry was not ready either to accept these ideas. Later on, in 1990, REMBRANDT effectively went into cold storage. Following a serious illness in the USA, Yücel had now left the company and returned to Turkey to take up a professorship at ITU. Shortly after this, a large part of the activities of the Wallsend division of BMT, where Yücel had been the divisional manager, were essentially closed down, and many of the staff, together with myself, were made redundant. After 25 years, I was unceremoniously told to leave by the end of the week. Following Yücel's example, and with his support as one of my referees, I obtained a lectureship in marine technology in Newcastle University, where I remained for a further very happy 20 years. As for REMBRANDT, it has now resurfaced and marketed once more by a Dutch subsidiary of BMT. It is sold all around the world and is used as a training aid on board ships. Yücel and I had predicted this 25 years ago, when we were told it was a non-starter. It would be satisfying to have some recognition that REMBRANDT was born at BSRA Wallsend some 25 years ago, that its concept was due to the efforts of Yücel and I, as well as those of our uniquely talented staff, George Davison, George Hine, and David Lamb. Maybe someday it will. Let me tell a few stories. Yücel loved to be controversial, particularly at conferences and presentations. He had many verbal battles with Professor Dick Bishop of UCL, with both of them saying things about each other, comments that shocked the audience, who thought it was absolutely outrageous. In fact, Yücel and Professor Bishop had the greatest respect for each other. I overheard Professor Bishop say to Yücel, "You know, Dr. Odabashi, I like you. We're similar characters, fiery, and like nothing better than a good argument." In discussions, Yücel had some interesting put-downs. One, I remember in particular, directed at a very eminent Hamburg professor who had given his paper at an international ship stability conference, and Yücel began his discussion thus. "The great mathematician Polya said, 'There is nothing more foolish than trying to solve a problem that you do not understand.'" There was stunned silence until Yücel gave his view why the paper had missed the point it was trying to address. Yücel set up a branch of BMT he called BMT International, and that was in Columbia, Maryland. He was, of course, its president. Several of us went over there for business purposes. Yücel made us all vice presidents. I still have the business cards. He said that in the USA, unless you're at least a vice president of the company you represent, no one in the Navy Department is likely to speak to you. The tradition at Wallsend over the years was to put on a lavish Christmas party for the children of the staff, and senior members such as Yücel all joined in wholeheartedly. On one occasion, while helping the conjurer to bring his equipment into the hall, his pet rabbit escaped, and Yücel and others chased it around and recaptured it outside in the car park. Another time, the magician accidentally locked his keys and all his equipment inside his car. He could not open it. Yücel took him home in his car to get the spare keys, and the show was slightly late. Then there was the time that Yücel's son, Ilderim, was quite puzzled, and I suppose disappointed, when he found out that the person dressed up in the Santa Claus outfit, giving out the presents, was me. Now, I finish on a more serious note. In 1986, while Yücel was still at Wallsend as divisional manager of the hydromechanics division, in the old BSRA Wallsend office, this consisted of the hydrodynamics and control, ship structures, noise and vibration, as well as hull form development. I was Yücel's deputy divisional manager, as well as the manager of the hydrodynamics and control department. In the southern part of the organisation, in the old NMI offices at Feltham and Teddington, were the rest of the hydromechanics division. This included the 3 model towing tanks, a circulating motor channel, an offshore basin, and cavitation tunnels. It was an organisation with world-class staff and facilities, and as well placed as any research establishment in the world. At that time, we in the North believed that we were in control of the fledgling company and that Yücel was in charge. This situation lasted a few months, but already clouds of doom were forming on the horizon. In the South, the senior staff were extremely unhappy and annoyed that we in the North had apparently gained control over their domain. But it was not to be for very long. It seems that certain BMT directors had a plan for the future which was rather different, and quite shockingly it did not feature keeping the world-class hydrodynamic facilities at all. I'm now going to recount some unwritten history as seen from my point of view. These events dramatically changed Yücel's career, as well as my own. 30 years later, I am possibly one of the few people alive that know about this matter, and it goes something like this. In the privatisation of NMI in 1984, the new joint BSRA NMI company, British Maritime Technology, or BMT, somehow ended up with title to the land at the Feltham site. This was a prime piece of land very close to London Airport and was valued at that time in excess of £25 million. The temptation was going to be too great for the directors in the South. They could rid themselves of the burden of the facilities, which were seen as loss-making, and make money at the same time. They sold the site. The world-class facilities, model tanks and cavitation tunnel were demolished, and the developers built a Tesco supermarket in their place. The only thing that can be seen today on the grassland behind the supermarket is the shape of the 400-metre-long towing tank, still visible on Google Maps and quite obvious to those who know what it is. However, all of this may never have happened, but for an almost impossibly cruel trick of fate. Yücel was preparing a confidential business plan for someone I'm going to call a very senior director of British shipbuilders, with the aim of setting out a profitable alternative for the future direction of BMT. It could be argued that this very senior director of British shipbuilders could be considered to have the authority to overrule the plans to sell the Feltham site. A business plan was drawn up by Yücel to cut the hemorrhaging losses due to the overheads and the high-spending service departments in certain parts of the company, while keeping the model tanks and facilities. One Friday in 1986, Yücel called me into his office, and as his deputy manager, he swore me to absolute secrecy. He gave me a handwritten copy of the business plan to study over the weekend. It had not been typed up because he did not want even his PA to know anything about it. I still have that copy. Then he told me far-reaching changes would start to happen in the next week. A lot of things in the company were likely to be reorganized. Then fate took a tragic hand in this plan. The director flew off on holiday for a weekend break. One evening he went out for a walk in the grounds of his hotel, and somehow in the dark he fell to his death down an unmarked vertical shaft. The plan was thwarted. Of course, Yücel was devastated. His powerful ally with his authority was gone. Shortly afterwards, it was announced that Yücel was going back to the USA to concentrate on the company that he had formed, BMT International. Yücel apologized to me before he left for the USA, saying that he could not protect his staff or the organization in Wallsend anymore. We would have to fend for ourselves in an uncertain future. I would not be surprised if I'm the only person left that knows anything about this tragic consequences of this incident. How different would things have been if the director had not gone on his short holiday, but stayed at home instead. Thank you for listening to my presentation this morning. It has been a pleasure preparing it. It has brought back lots of wonderful memories of my time working with Yücel. On the death of Hamlet, his friend Horatio says, "Good night, sweet prince, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest." So rest in peace, Yücel, till we meet again, dear friend. Thank you, everyone.